Now, one of the topics that remains and that needs to be dealt with before this retreat comes to an end is Dhammanupassana. And please remember, towards the beginning of the retreat, we started discussing the four establishments of mindfulness, and out of those we've dealt with already with the mindful contemplation of the body, namely Kayanupassana, Satipaṭṭhāna, and we've also dealt with the mindful contemplation of feelings, and then of the mind, Cittanupassana, Satipaṭṭhāna. And the one that remains is Dhammanupassana, Satipaṭṭhāna, namely mindful contemplation of Dhammas. Now, the term Dhamma represents some difficulties when it comes to its translation, and some people have translated this term as phenomena, or as facts in general, or as patterns of events, or as conditions, principles, or one could translate this term as group of teachings, especially based on what then follows as an explanation in the Satipaṭṭhāna Sutta, namely the contemplation of Dhamma is said to consist of a contemplation of the five hindrances, and also the five aggregates, and then the six sense spheres, and then the seven awakening factors, and the four noble truths. And these are all groups of teachings. So that would be one way to proceed. Venerable Analayo, in his book Satipaṭṭhāna, proposes, as a number of other writers these days, proposes to leave the term untranslated, since it's difficult to capture its meaning in the English language with just one word. Now, one could, apart from a group of teachings, one could say these Dhammas constitute frameworks or points of reference to be applied during the contemplation. And this is what Venerable Analayo is proposing. Now, tonight we definitely will not have the time to deal with all of these different aspects here, the five hindrances, the five aggregates, and so on. And instead, we shall limit ourselves to just the last aspect, namely the Four Noble Truths. And with regard to mindful contemplation of the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha has said the following, as is recorded in the Majjhima Nikaya, its first volume, or section 62. And there it says, he or she knows as it really is. This is dukkha. And then, he or she knows as it really is, this is the arising of dukkha. And then, as number 3, he or she knows as it really is, this is the cessation of dukkha. And the last one, he or she knows as it really is, this is the path or the way leading to the cessation of dukkha. Now, you've heard the term dukkha mentioned in just this short paragraph 4 times. And so, based on this, one could then be misled to think that the Buddha's teachings are mostly about dukkha. And if we then translate this term as temporarily as or tentatively as suffering, then one might think, oh my goodness, it's all on just about suffering. Well, the first two noble truths are indeed about negative aspects of existence. However, understanding clearly, deeply understanding the noble truth of the existence of suffering and also the origin of suffering or dukkha, this then leads to the positive qualities of or positive values in the form of freedom from dukkha and the path that leads to that freedom from dukkha. And the path that leads to the cessation of dukkha is the Eightfold Noble Path. Now, when it comes to the realization of the Four Noble Truths, do you think this is accompanied by despair and frustration? Or do you think it's accompanied by joy and happiness? Huh? Huh? Joy and happiness. Yes, indeed. And to prove this very point, a paragraph from the Samyutta Nikaya, it's the 56th Samyutta and the 35th Sutta, where the Buddha says, "It is fitting, or bhikkhus, bhikkhunis, and lay meditators, for a clansman intent on his or her good to accept the offer." For what reason? Because this samsara is without discoverable beginning, a first point cannot be discerned of blows of spears, blows by spears, blows by swords, blows by axes. And even though this may be so, I do not say that the breakthrough to the Four Noble Truths is accompanied by suffering or displeasure. Rather, the breakthrough to the Four Noble Truths is accompanied by happiness and joy. And then the question is raised, what for? And then the Four Noble Truths are being given one by one. So, when it comes to the expression or formulation of the Four Noble Truths, the term dukkha appears as mentioned 4 times, and thus it's helpful to be clear on its meaning. Now, Venerable Analayo, in his book Satipaṭṭhāna, proposes to get at the correct meaning by making use of the Sanskrit etymology of the term dukkha. So, in Sanskrit, the part ka, the second part of the word dukkha, means an axle hole of a wheel, whereas du or dus in Sanskrit means difficulty or badness. Hence, the compound term as duksha, and duksha is the Sanskrit version, in Pali it would be dukkha. So the meaning then becomes an axle hole that is, an axle that is not fitting properly into its hole, and this then stands for disharmony or for friction. Another way of interpreting the term dukkha again is coming from the Sanskrit, and then du as before means the same thing, difficulty or badness, and the second part then is or the ka is derived from sta, which means standing or abiding. Hence, then dusta or dukkha then means or could mean standing badly, or uneasiness, being uncomfortable. And certainly Venerable Nyanamodi, a British monk who, for instance, translated the Visuddhimagga and a number of other terms, he he was one who proposed the translation as uneasiness. Now, and certainly we can then say that certainly the term dukkha does or have a meaning, a comprehensive meaning, such as unsatisfactoriness, and only suffering or suffering then would be only the second certain choice of translation. Now, it is said that all wholesome dhammas fit into the Four Noble Truths. And the illustration that is given for this is that of the footprints of an elephant. Just like the footprints of all other animals fit into that of into the footprint of an elephant, so too all wholesome teachings that the Buddha has given fit into the Four Noble Truths. And it is said, with regard to these Four Noble Truths, that they are the synthesis of the entire teachings of the Buddha. So brought to an essence, or expressed as the quintessence. Now, the Buddha originally gave this discourse on the Four Noble Truths, when he gave his very first discourse ever to the group of 5 ascetics, the Pancha Waggiya in Sarna, which is close to Varanasi. Back then it was known as Benares. And so the Four Noble Truths are the truth of the existence of suffering, or dukkha, the origin of dukkha, and then the cessation of that same dukkha, and the path or way leading to its cessation. And to elaborate just a little bit on these Four Truths, and then later on we shall go one step deeper. So in other words, the first noble truth states that all forms of existence whatsoever are unsatisfactory. And the second noble truth says that this dukkha is produced by craving, and in a wider sense, later on we shall see, it is also based in ignorance, since ignorance is underlying all of the unwholesome mental states. And so it is the cessation of dukkha that brings to an end this dukkha, or this suffering that we have to endure as we go through the cycle of existence, namely samsara. And instead of saying cessation of dukkha, we can express it in just one single word, and this would be what? Well, liberation. Yes, two right words. So both nibbana and liberation is correct. And And so it is the experience of Nibbana, or it is said that in Nibbana there is simply no unsatisfactoriness, no dukkha. And also it is said that the craving ceases in Nibbana. Now, then slightly, and then as for the fourth noble truth, well, as we've seen already, it's that eightfold noble path that leads to the experience of Nibbana. Now, the Buddha then, in various places, has given in greater detail what he means by each of those four noble truths. And so examples of the truth of suffering then are given as physical events and certain mental events. And so physical events of unsatisfactoriness or dukkha are birth and then decay, and then also death, and then on a mental level sorrow, lamentation, despair, grief, and then also mental distress. And so in a wider, and this, or included in the first noble truth, are also, as the Buddha explains elsewhere, experiences where we are separated from our loved ones, and we are together with those whom we don't like. And the one way of stating the first noble truth is by saying that all formations of the five groups of clinging are said to be dukkha or unsatisfactory. Now, there are the following meanings to this. Namely, in comparison to the experience of Nibbana, which is finally, or in the end, the cessation of conditioned phenomena, so the arising of those conditioned phenomena is, not peaceful. Whereas the experience of Nibbana, as mentioned, namely the cessation of all conditioned phenomena, is said to be peaceful. Now, for a meditator or non-meditator who has not yet, or who does not have a direct experience of Nibbana, this statement is kind of somewhat difficult to digest. So it's one part of the statement you can relate to, but that the cessation of conditioned phenomena is supposed to be peaceful. How can you know this? And you can know this only from direct experience. And the only way to get there is really through meditation practice. However, nonetheless, the fact still remains that the non-arising of formations is peaceful, and so in relation to this, all other formations, conditioned formations as they are occurring, is not peaceful, and thus a form of suffering or unsatisfactoriness. So that's a higher way of interpreting this first noble truth. Now, what do you think? It is said that the origin or the cause for the dukkha or unsatisfactoriness lies in craving. And so this craving is given as sensuous craving, kama, kama tanha, then craving for existence, bhava tanha, and then craving for non-existence, abhava tanha, or vibhava tanha. And so because there is craving, suffering is there. Now, then when there is if there were to be no craving, then it follows that there is no dukkha or no unsatisfactoriness. Can you think of a group of people for whom this would be valid? Yes, what?
I can't think of the word. Anhara?
Oh, the arahants. The arahants. There you go. Quite right. And so in the arahants, all craving, the three kinds of craving mentioned, have been eradicated. And as there is no more craving, it follows that there is no experience of unsatisfactoriness or dukkha. So the Four Noble Truths are valid for the one who is not yet an arahant, and who is still caught up in these formations or phenomena of the five aggregates and always wanting to hold on to something. And all of this is, in the beginning of the practice, isn't all that obvious. But when one practices for a longer while, and one's practice gets deeper, at times one might see quite clearly how the mind keeps craving for another object, for another object, for another object, and so in the absence of some pleasant objects, the mind will even settle on some unsatisfactory object, as long as it has something to hold on to. And that's just the way it is. And so when the experience of Nibbana takes place, one realizes that there's a state of non-grasping. And simply there are no phenomena occurring there. There's nothing to grasp there. There are no sights to grasp there, no sounds, no smells and tastes, and nor tactile formations, nor any mental formations. And so in the absence of craving, there is no unsatisfactoriness. So the wider explanation on the second noble truth is simply given. What is this noble truth of the origin of suffering? It is that craving which gives rise to fresh rebirth, and bound up with lust and greed, now here, now there, finds ever fresh delight. It is the sensual craving, kama, bhava, then the craving for existence, bhava tanha, and the first one is kama tanha, the second one bhava tanha, and then the craving for non-existence, and vibhava tanha. Now, the further explanation on the third insight, that knowledge is given as by the Buddha, and as follows, namely what is this noble truth of the cessation of dukkha or unsatisfactoriness, namely, it is complete fading away and extinction of this craving, its forsaking and giving up liberation and detachment from it. And these are all different expressions, yet they're all pointing in the same direction, namely the direction of letting go. And our meditation practice is not a practice of accumulating new things, but rather a practice of letting go, and in particular of the unwholesome mental states. So we don't want more of them, but we want to let go of them. And then, as a further explanation of the fourth noble truth, then come the individual path factors. But before we go into this, let's stop here and then take a closer look at Nibbana itself and some of its definitions and explanations on it. Now, in a general sense, Nibbana is certainly being defined in the Samyutta Nikaya 38 in the first sutta as great extinction of hatred, extinction of delusion. This is called Nibbana. And so another definition that something can be found in one of the commentaries to the Samyutta Nikaya is as follows, namely, Salayatana Nirodham Sandaya Vasitam. It is Nibbana that is called the cessation of the six sense bases, for in Nibbana the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body and the mind cease, and perceptions of forms, sounds and so on fade away. So it's a fading away of those different perceptions. And in the Majjhima Nikaya we find in one portion an expression where it says there is an escape from this entire field of perception. And the commentary to the Majjhima Nikaya then explains this as Nibbana, namely the cessation of suffering. So the Buddha then kind of gives a hint of what the nature of Nibbana is in saying that it is an escape from this whole field of perception. Now, Nibbana is defined in the Abhidhamma in the following way, namely that its characteristic is peace and its function is certain deathlessness, and its certain manifestation is given as certain signlessness. And when it is said that its characteristic is peace, then with this we don't just mean some mundane type of peace and or demonstrating for peace, but rather a peace that arises within. And it's an ultimate form of peace, and as mentioned earlier on, that comes with the cessation of conditioned phenomena. Now, the reason why the manifestation is given as the signlessness is simply because Nibbana has no sign. So you cannot say that Nibbana is maybe thin or fat, nor can you attribute to it colors like, it's a pure state, so it must be white then in color. It's neither white nor yellow nor red nor anything else. And on top of this, is Nibbana limited to a particular location? Let's say, is it available only in Bodh Gaya? Do you have to go on pilgrimage in order to pick it up in Bodh Gaya? What do you think? This is another no. And Nibbana can be attained anywhere as long as the necessary conditions are being or are there in terms of the development of the mind. And its function is as deathlessness because it is a state that does not possess or is not subject to birth, to decay, or to death. So there's Nibbana is said to be or not to be anicca, but rather nicca, which is permanent. Now, Nibbana is a state that is very different from our ordinary conditioned experiences and ordinary mundane experiences, and hence the consciousness that takes it as an object is classified as a supramundane consciousness or knowledge. And Nibbana cannot be accessed by much thinking or analyzing, nor can we gain an experience of Nibbana through reading hundreds or thousands of Dhamma books. And Nibbana is also not accessible by way of logic, by way of ordinary logic. Now, it is said to be eternal in nature, duva, and furthermore, it's given as a happy state, namely sukha. So all ordinary mundane formations are conditioned formations are said to be dukkha, which means unsatisfactory. Yet Nibbana is one state that is given the attributes as being conducive to happiness or sukha. Now, another way of experiencing or explaining the nature of Nibbana is by saying that it is a non-sensate type of experience. Now, with this we have to distinguish between sensate experiences and non-sensate experiences. Our ordinary seeing of sights and hearing of sounds and smelling various odors and so on, these are said to be sensate experiences. The experiences that depend on the six sense processes. Whereas in the case of Nibbana, neither is there some sense object, nor is there a sense door to speak of. There is simply no sense door or no sense door process there. And hence, it is said to be a non-sensate experience. Now, Nibbana is said to be the highest bliss or the highest form of happiness. Now, categories that we are familiar with in our ordinary meditation practice, such as the four primary elements, which then make up the different sensations that we experience in the body, and the different mental states. All of these categories simply are not valid in Nibbana. So, to think that Nibbana is tantamount to the four primary elements would be, again, wrong. And sometimes people think that, well, if Nibbana is the cessation of formations, then maybe it's nothingness. But it's not nothingness either. And it is simply a reality on its own, different from everything else. And in the Abhidhamma, four ultimate realities are being mentioned, and the four are, namely, materiality, rupa, and then mental factors, cetasika, and then consciousness, citta, and as the last quality, nibbana. Now, the first three are still within the mundane realm, whereas nibbana is different from the first three in the way that it is supramundane, or it relates to the supramundane. Now, when we realize nibbana, then, or when the attainment of path knowledge and fruition knowledge takes place, then this brings about a realization of nibbana, and it is said with this experience also the Four Noble Truths are understood. But it's not that these are all separate things, but rather these are four aspects connected with the same experience, namely the realization or the attainment of path knowledge. Now, when it comes to the attainment of path knowledge, then this particular experience brings about an eradication of certain mental defilements from the stream of consciousness. And for the case, or in the case of a stream enterer, those first three fetters to go are the fetter of the wrongful belief in the existence of a self, Sakaya deity in Pali, and then the second one is the fetter of skeptical doubt, Vicikicca, and then the last one is the fetter of believing that, or holding the wrongful view that by engaging in certain rites and rituals one can gain nibbana. And with later attainments, especially with the third path attainment and fourth path attainment, other mental defilements or fetters will be uprooted from the mind once and forever. It is said that with the attainment of path and fruition knowledge, or especially path knowledge connected with the path of stream entry, comes an unshakable faith in the Buddha, in the Dhamma, and also in the Sangha. And so earlier on, actually at the very outset of one's meditation practice, one's faith may still have been quite shaky, but with the attainment of stream entry, this situation changes drastically, and one's faith becomes very firm. And it is said that one will be reborn as a human being only 7 or Deva only 7 more times. Now, maybe. There's one further important factor that goes along, or that marks the experience of stream entry, namely that one's virtue becomes impeccable, namely that one, so the commentary explains, one will not violate any of the 5 precepts. Now, should a meditator have had an unusual experience in his or her meditation practice, then it's a wise thing to simply check whether one is fulfilling these various factors or not. And so it's wise to observe one's own behavior, not just for a few days, but, as the Venerable Sadhu Pandita recommends, a period of 7 years. And if within this period one finds that one is nicely keeping the precepts, and one's faith in the Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha is unshakable, then there is a likelihood that something really special happened in one's practice. There are other ways of criteria of verifying one's experience, but I'll not go into those. Now, the 4th Noble Truth is given as the path or way that leads to the cessation of unsatisfactoriness, and this path or way then is further explained as the Eightfold Noble Path. And this Eightfold Noble Path consists of the following factors. The first path factor is that of right view, samma deity pani, and then the second one is the right path, or the path factor of right thought or right intention, and this is given as sammasankappa in Pali, and I'll say more with regard to each and every one of them in a few moments. And so these first 2 form what is known as the wisdom group of the Eightfold Noble Path. Then we have as number 3 right action. So that is samma kamanta, and right speech, samma vaja, and then right action, samma kamanta, and then as the next one, right livelihood, samma ajiva. And those 3 together are known as the sila group, or the virtue group of the Eightfold Noble Path, since they concern one's virtuous conduct. And the last 3 path factors, so number 6, 7, and 8, cover right effort, samma vayama in the Pali scripture language, then right mindfulness, samma sati, and the last one is given as samma samadhi, right certain concentration. So those last 3 together as a group are referred to as the concentration group of the Eightfold Noble Path. Now, a meditator who wants to gain the Dhamma, needs to practice according or along these 8 path factors. And so his or her practice needs to, or he or she needs to train in virtue, sila, needs to train in concentration or the concentration group, and also needs to train in the wisdom group, the panyatna group. Now, what is meant by right view? The explanation given in the text is namely as the Four Noble Truths. So, right understanding or the knowledge of the truth of suffering or dukkha, the origin of this dukkha, its cessation, and the way leading to it. So, in an ultimate sense, it's that. However, as one meditates, one will be experiencing those 8 path factors already in one's practice. And the way the Venerable Sayadaw Pandita explains this is every moment that you're mindful of the rising movement of the abdomen or the falling movement or some pain or ache or mental state, or you're mindful during your walking meditation, all of those 8 path factors are present. Namely, you are well established in sila, you're taking the precepts, the 8 precepts every night, you're observing them, and as a result of this, your speech is wholesome, and your deeds are also, bodily deeds are wholesome, and then livelihood is also wholesome. So you're not, while you're on retreat, observing rising and falling, you're not dealing in weapons. Obviously not. And I'll say more on this. And so the virtue group is fulfilled, and then as you're observing some predominant object, or whatever the object may be, right effort will be there. Namely, again and again, moment by moment, you're propelling the mind towards the predominant object of observation. So this requires effort, samavayama, and based on a continuous effort, what arises? Mindfulness arises. So you're mindful of the predominant object moment by moment. And if this then happens for a while, the mind will gradually, or the mind will fall squarely on the object of observation. And then with this gradually concentration develops. And so hence right concentration is also there. So as we are doing, actually carrying out the practice moment by moment, the 3 path factors of the concentration group are present. And involved in all of this are also right intentions. So when we do so, we do so with an intention of renunciation, renouncing the sense pleasures and our luxuries and whatnot. And then the second one is the intention of goodwill, so abhyapada sankappa in Pali. So we stay away from unwholesome, from hateful thoughts. And furthermore, when we do undertake the meditation practice, we do so with an intention of non-cruelty. So avihimsa sankappa in the Pali scriptural language. Now, when all of these 7 path factors are present, then what happens to the first path factor, namely in the form of right view? Will it arise or not arise? Well, naturally it arises. It arises in a simple way, namely, that you as a meditator, that you are clearly seeing the nature or knowing the nature of the predominant object under observation. And instead of saying right view, we can also say right knowledge or right understanding or basically wisdom. And so as long as we're practicing properly, we're establishing virtue, the three factors of the concentration group are there, and right intentions are also given, then we'll gain some wisdom regarding the predominant objects. And so the first path factor in the form of right view is the outcome of the remaining 7. So this first path factor is, in a sense, in a sense, it leads. In a sense, it's the result of the other 7, and in a sense, it also represents our final understanding of the Dhamma. So it represents the culmination of successful meditation practice. Now, this much on right view, and right thought is then explained. It is by the Buddha himself. It is a mind free from sensual lust, from ill will and cruelty. So positively expressed, it is a mind in which the intentions are towards renunciation and temporarily or permanently giving up one's circle of friends and relatives and luxuries and whatnot, and in order to then train in Sila, Samadhi and Panya. And then absence of ill will means thoughts of or having intentions of goodwill towards all beings around, and then also intentions of non-cruelty, not wanting to harm any being nor oneself. Now, right speech is the third path factor, and this gets explained as abstaining from 4 things, namely lying, so false speech, and then slanderous talk, and furthermore harsh or rough language, and then gossip or idle talk. And when we use these, or when right speech is expressed in a negative manner as not indulging in this or that form of wrongful speech, then there's also a positive component to the whole thing, namely that instead, not only that we stay away from false speech, from lying, but we say what is conducive, or what is in accordance with facts and figures. And instead of indulging in slanderous talk or backbiting, we indulge in speech that promotes harmony and unity and friendship among beings. And instead of, or apart from staying away from harsh or rough language, we then cultivate a language that is sweet and soothing to the ears. It's not that you're twisting the truth, but you choose your words and you say things in a way that others can accept. And then, apart from staying away from idle talk or gossip or frivolous talk, we indulge in, if at all, if we have to talk, let's say outside of a retreat or so, then we try to limit ourselves to meaningful talk. And the Buddha speaks of, if I'm not mistaken, 38 kinds of actually animal talk, tirachana katha, and literally it means animal talk. And so what he means by this is talk by the well, and talk on wars, and talk on robbers, and latest prices and whatnot. And so we shouldn't get involved in this kind of talk, but rather develop, or if we have to talk, then limit our conversations on the development of concentration, of wisdom, of detachment, liberation in virtue, and so on and so forth. And the Buddha says, well, if there's nothing to talk about, then it's best to keep, to observe noble silence. Now, this, of course, in the outside world is not always easy to maintain. And now, so this much regarding the right speech, and maybe in this connection, since I'm very interested in conflict resolution, please, conflicts among human beings, to a great extent involve language, and the language that we use or wrongly use oftentimes may greatly contribute to a conflict. So it's really wise to be restrained with what we say, and think 5 times before we say something naughty. And because easily things might then get misconstrued and or misperceived, and then it might take a lot of effort to straighten out these difficulties. And staying away from these 4 forms of unwholesome speech, as mentioned by the Buddha, would be one aspect, and another, and then practicing or training in wholesome speech would be a second aspect, and a third aspect is to work towards clear speech, being very clear in what one wants to say, clear and to the point. Now, the next path factor is that of right action, and this covers 3 things, namely right bodily actions. And the aspects are, to refrain from killing, from stealing, and from sexual misconduct. And in all 3 cases, if we were to indulge in them, engage in them, then we bring a lot of harm onto other beings and also onto ourselves. And this is not necessary. And if one thinks of the psychological damage that is being done by people who disregard these very basic principles of humanity, then they bring then wait a minute. What I wanted to say is, knowing the psychological damage that is caused by these, one will then refrain from these kinds of actions. Now, right livelihood is certainly given in the following ways, namely, a disciple rejects wrong livelihood and gains his or her living by means of right livelihood. But this won't help you very much. With this, you still don't quite know what right livelihood is. And so the Buddha has been, or was certainly more specific, and he says that dealing in weapons would be a form of wrongful livelihood or wrong livelihood, and also dealing in living beings would be wrong livelihood, so slavery, prostitution, and then furthermore, meat production and butchery is also considered as a wrong livelihood, and then dealing in poisons, and lastly, dealing in intoxicants. Now, in a more general way, the Buddha specifies and says that one should acquire wealth only by legal means and not illegally, and one should acquire wealth peacefully and without coercion or violence. And furthermore, one should acquire wealth honestly and not by not through trickery or deceit, and one should acquire wealth in ways which do not entail harm or entail harm in certain suffering for others. Now, since our modern world is rather complex, and there are many professions and many occupations that simply didn't exist at the time of the Buddha, well, we just have to decide for ourselves whether a certain profession is or could be considered as certain right livelihood or not. Now, training in these three path factors connected with the virtue group will shape our conduct, our bodily and verbal conduct in certain ways that is conducive to the further training in concentration and wisdom. And without this kind of shaping our bodily and verbal conduct, would we come across difficulties over and over again in the form of ending up with a bad conscience and having or experiencing remorse over things that we may have done or said in the past. And this then will lead to agitation of the mind. And with an agitated mind, it's simply difficult to meditate. The mind needs to be calm and still to clearly observe what's happening. Now, the next path factor is that of right effort, and the Buddha explains this as the four kinds of supreme effort, namely the effort to avoid the arising of so far unarisen unwholesomeness, then furthermore the effort to overcome unwholesome mental states that have already arisen, then furthermore, the effort to bring about wholesome mental states that have not yet arisen, and as the last aspect, to maintain and further develop wholesome mental states that have already arisen. So, this fourfold form of supreme effort here can be further reduced to two, namely, to abandon unwholesome mental states, making an effort towards abandoning unwholesome mental states, and the effort made towards the development of wholesome mental states. Now, the seventh path factor is that of right mindfulness, samasati in Pali, and it is, or the Buddha explains it further as the four establishments of mindfulness. Chattaro Satipaṭṭhāna in Pali, and fortunately I don't need to say anything more on this, since we've made already several Dhamma talks on this topic. And the last path factor, the eighth path factor, is that of right concentration, sammasamadhi, and the Buddha himself explains it in one place as consisting of the four jhanas, so certain levels of absorption, of concentration. However, this doesn't mean that vipassana is excluded, and in particular the so-called momentary concentration, khanika samadhi, that arises in the context of vipassana meditation, that this is excluded. And there are other references that then do include this momentary concentration. So for those here under the eighth path factor, those who practice samatha, the meaning is for right concentration, namely the four jhanas, and for those who practice vipassana or insight, the right concentration comes in the form of khanika samadhi. Now, it is said with regard to these four noble truths that certain actions need to be undertaken or need to be there. The first noble truth, namely that of the existence of suffering, needs to be fully understood, and the noble truth of the origin of suffering in the form of craving, and in a wider sense including ignorance, needs to be abandoned, and the third noble truth of the cessation of dukkha needs to be realized, while the last and fourth noble truth needs to be developed. And the Buddha himself at certain times speaks of himself as a physician, and sometimes in some places when he speaks of the Dhamma, he speaks of it as a medicine. And thus there is an illustration for the Buddha gives an illustration for the Four Noble Truths, namely that of an illness or a disease. So the truth of the existence of suffering compares to an illness or having a disease. Whereas the second truth of the origin of suffering corresponds to a virus, which then is the cause of the disease. And then the third noble truth is being illustrated by a cure, by the cure of the disease, which then is given as the status of or condition of health. And the last noble truth is compared with medicine or with a cure. So, practicing the Eightfold Noble Path is the medicine that we need to take and develop. Now, this illustration, this fourfold illustration of the disease, of the virus, of health, and of the cure, interestingly enough, also then is found in some older texts, medicinal or texts related to medical sciences. But as Professor Wetzler points out, maybe these these are based on the Buddha's original illustration. Now, in Samyutta Nikaya, the Buddha explains these four aspects with regard to the Four Noble Truths in the following ways. Namely, there are things that need to be fully understood by direct knowledge, and those are the five aggregates subject to clinging. And then there are things to be abandoned, and those are ignorance and craving for existence. And then there are things to be realized by the knowledge, and so this is true knowledge and liberation. And there are things that need to be developed, and this then is given as serenity meditation and insight meditation. Now, there are, the Visuddhimagga explains the nature of Nibbana and the path, and the person to walk this path from an ultimate point of view, and in the form of two verses. And the two verses, the first one you've heard before, and the second one is new. Namely, mere suffering exists, no sufferer is found. The deed is, but no doer of the deed is there. Nibbana is, but not the man or woman that enters it. The path is, but not the traveler on it is seen. And furthermore, the first truth, the noble truth, and the second noble truth are empty. Empty of permanency, empty of bliss, of self and beauty. And the deathless realm is empty of an ego or self, and free from permanency, pleasure and self is the path. Now, what we have here, in particular in the second verse, are the qualities of the first and second noble truth, and then of Nibbana itself. So, the first and second truth are they're not, so they're empty of permanency, so they're impermanent. Formations are impermanent, and they are empty of bliss, which means they're not sukha but dukkha. They're empty of a self, so they're not atta but anatta, and they're empty of beauty, which then means they're not subha but rather asubha. But when it comes to the experience of nibbana, and the term for this here is deathless realm, then there it is empty of an ego, so there's just no self there. And again, the path itself is said to be free from permanency and then pleasure and self. So the aspect of non-self is very clear when it comes to the experience of nibbana. Now, formations are said to be unsatisfactory, as mentioned earlier on to some extent. Simply, for conditioned formations are said to be unsatisfactory simply because of the fact that they are impermanent. And so their being impermanent then is a form of suffering. Now, the Satipaṭṭhāna Sutta, in its chapter or its section on Dhammanupassana, namely mindful contemplation of Dhammas, and in particular of the Four Noble Truths, simply says that one knows those respective truths. But there is a shorter discourse from the Sutta Nipata that gives some further or indicates some further instructions regarding those Four Noble Truths, and there it says that a meditator could focus either on knowing the presence of dukkha, and then also to focus on the conditions, or to know the condition that leads to the arising of dukkha, which comes in the form of craving. And the other thing to focus on would be to know the cessation of that dukkha, and also to then know the condition that leads to the cessation of this dukkha, and the condition simply lies in the Noble Eightfold Path. So this then would add somewhat another level or quality to the contemplation, mindful contemplation of the Four Noble Truths. Now, let me conclude tonight's Dhamma talk by wishing, may the practice of the four Satipaṭṭhānas, the four establishments of mindfulness, diligently and wholeheartedly carried out, may it lead all of you to, or may it issue in the realization of the Four Noble Truths, and this as such then marks the culmination of successful Satipaṭṭhāna practice. And may this happen as soon as possible. And this is it for tonight. Now, do you have any questions? Yes, way in the back, it's John, I think.
You said a little bit about path knowledge. Could you say something about fruition knowledge and the relationship between the two?
Yes. Okay, so the attainment of path knowledge, or the attainment of the path of stream entry, technically happens, roughly speaking, happens as follows. So a meditator develops his or her practice up to the knowledge of equanimity about formation, so sankopeka, and then once this knowledge is well developed, well balanced, then when the right conditions are there, the practice will automatically go into the knowledge of conformity, anuloma jnana, which lasts only for a very short period of time, and then comes what is known as gotra jnana, namely the change of the knowledge of the change of lineage. This too is just one mind moment, if I'm not mistaken, and then according to the Abhidhamma, and then this is followed by just one moment of, well, the mind, there's certain preparatory and whatnot, and then comes the path or moment of path consciousness, which is a very unique type of consciousness, which well, it performs several functions, namely, as we've seen, it abandons a certain number of mental defilements, and with this also comes the realization of the Four Noble Truths. And once then path knowledge has path knowledge or path consciousness, magga or magga-citta, has passed away, and then it will be followed by two, or in the case of a meditator with keen faculties, by three moments of fruition consciousness. And fruition consciousness, just like path consciousness, takes nibbana as an object. So the supramundane state. In that, both of them are the same. They're similar. But fruition consciousness does not eradicate any of the mental defilements. But rather, its function is to enjoy the fruits of one's hard and laborious meditation practice over many days. So it's reaping the fruits. And this fruition knowledge can be experienced by a meditator many times, many thousands, if not 100,000s of times. And whereas in the case of path knowledge, there is only path knowledge or path consciousness. There is only one single path consciousness for every level of attainment. So, with regard to the attainment of stream entry, there's only one moment of path consciousness in one's existence, in one's present existence. And so not two or three. Now, that fruition consciousness can be developed. And so at first, like I said, it arises only for two moments or three moments, but later on it can be, or the mind can be trained in a way that it lasts for several seconds, and then for several minutes, and then for 5 minutes and 10 minutes, and half an hour, and 1 hour, and 2 hours, and so on. In both cases, path knowledge and fruition knowledge, it is, since both consciousnesses take Nibbana as an object, there is no ordinary seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching in the experience. So it is this non-sensate experience. Those are some of the, and maybe as a further point. Once a meditator has gained path and fruition knowledge, then it's a good idea to then further develop this fruition consciousness to the best of one's abilities, since this then will pave the ground or the way for meditate or for one's practice towards the realization of the next path. So the mind needs to be trained. It needs to be skilled in different ways of staying in that place of peace, of fruition for longer periods, and also frequently to experience this. And so immediacy would be another aspect. Immediacy means as quickly as possible. And so maybe one more feature in connection with path consciousness and fruition consciousness. Both of them are linked. So when path consciousness arises, the first time it must inherently be followed by fruition knowledge. But once path knowledge of the first path has occurred, then fruition knowledge will arise only by itself, and it will not be preceded by path knowledge anymore. Path knowledge with regard to the first path, to path of stream entry. So, John, does this answer your question?
Well enough for tonight.
So what is missing? The personal experience. Okay, anything else? Well, if there are no more questions, then let's end. And then there's one more Dhamma talk tomorrow.